Hello and welcome, my name is Meepolis, and this, my friends, is literally graphic. And today we are looking at a work that I view as extremely politically incorrect, namely Herge's Peppy in the Wild West. While it's not a book I had read previously or one that I would necessarily now recommend to many people, since I grew up reading Tintin and like to deconstruct books I read before becoming a totally, quote, anarchist feminist social justice warrior, this seemed like something I should take a look at. And I'm actually pretty glad I did in retrospect, if for no other reason than the introduction for this Fantagraphics edition, which was like the first English edition in a million years, which I'm, again, not sure was totally necessary, but the introduction was quite interesting for someone who had grown up reading Herge. It was incredibly biased in the pro-Herge or Herge, I forget which is the correct pronunciation, direction. It did introduce me to the questions around his career during the Nazi occupation, and a general timeline of his career beyond Tintin, which I hadn't ever really dove into, so that was really nice to just have easily presented to me as I was reading something else. Otherwise, this book was an extremely fast, supposedly all ages read. That aspect has definitely not aged well. That probably belongs in a museum, but not actually anywhere else. Being all too familiar with the quote-unquote I'm not racist, hashtag all lives matter, and I don't see color side of things, I can see why this book could be found as charming all ages political commentary, but it is racist, which does trump everything else. Now, having read Peppy in the West, Tintin in America, and the oh so incredibly racist Tintin in the Congo, it is also kind of interesting, at least as a white person who isn't triggered by these things, to compare and contrast the different ways in which Herge's racist ideas play out in regards to different groups of people. While I'm certainly not an expert in anything related to these intersections, it does seem obvious that Herge, most likely, like many people in his time and place, was profoundly affected by A, romanticized Westerns from America, and B, Belgium's treatment / philosophy / attitude towards their African colony. This is somewhat important to my daily life as well because of a all too common argument against the existence of systematic racism, namely that racism only looks one way and that different people who find themselves outside the social construct umbrella of whiteness cannot be discriminated against in different ways that still boil down to racism. Both in Peppy in the Wild West and Tintin in America, the indigenous people, misrepresented as a weird mishmash of different tribal customs with a dash of complete fabrication, are much more sympathetic and articulate than the people indigenous to the Congos, but no, this does not make it less racist. Even if he was having quite a bit of fun with them at times, Herge was still relying heavily, very heavily, on the racist characters that America produced of its indigenous people, which, considering that he claimed to be rather fond of America's indigenous population and probably did think he was being very complimentary, it's only actually more unacceptable for someone who should have possibly gone above and beyond, even in the low information environment we had pre-internet, and figured out some of the truth behind the stereotypes. While I'm sure many of my white peers will have little issue passing this off as a product of its time, and possibly some non-white peers, the only mitigating factor I currently feel comfortable with is that the original American creators of these stereotypes should be held more responsible for these racist ideas than perhaps the international audience who recycled them. This, though, could just be covered for the fact that I recently really fell in love with Dragon Ball, and he does a similar thing with indigenous characters in that, and especially in that Dragon Ball, to take a brief aside, it definitely felt like he was dealing more with the pop culture creation that was the Native American than he was with reality, and so that really made me question how wholly responsible he was for his depiction, and how putting Native Americans alongside Frankenstein and the Mummy and other things and just turning it into a genre is really more to blame. But I'm going to hold on to this idea rather loosely because I know that many indigenous people that I listen to in North America are still rather frustrated with the ways in which people in Europe and other international people, especially Germans, apparently like really fetishize the noble savage in a way that they think is respectful, but that a lot of the actual indigenous people I listen to find rather insulting and racist. Otherwise, this book was a lot more colorful and simpler than Tintin. I was not aware that Herge had done work that involved anthropomorphized animals, but the influence of Disney on European comics in general, and Herge specifically, was another interesting part of the introduction. So yeah, as I said, it was an interesting kind of eye-opening experience, but not one that necessarily everyone needs to have. I think I gave it 2 out of 5 stars, perhaps being too generous, but it felt like bad faith to give something that was put together so well and was a product a bit of its time, a 1-star review, as I try to save that for the super hateful, you should know better Frank Miller kind of side of things. I mean, you can't give anything less than 1 star without it just looking like you aren't actually rating it. So I guess that would be a nice feature if I ever improve upon the Goodreads thing. But yeah, so I will see you all next time. Bye! And as always, Literally Graphic is recorded on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and Anishinaabe people, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat Nation. I live here because of British colonization, Indigenous genocide, and more geographically specific, Treaty 13, also known as the Toronto Purchase, which was finalized in 1805 between representatives of the Crown and certain Mississauga peoples. This treaty was a lie and has since been broken many times over. Saying so reflects only my own small steps towards knowing the truth and does nothing for reconciliation.